Oh, goody.
All right, what is going on, everybody? It's Zombies here again, and today we are back with another episode of Meta Monday. So I believe this is going to be episode number 6, and this is going to be the kind of first look at the meta after the kind of impact of the 22.2 patch, which brought us 5 new mercenaries. Pretty much all or the majority of them seem very powerful and relevant to the PvP meta. So we have definitely had a bit more of a shakeup than we have been used to in the past compared to Cookie releasing or even Valeera releasing, as those drops, while they had strong characters, really only had one top tier character in each drop, and this drop we definitely got more than one. So today, we're going to take a look at a couple of the comps that have started to become a bit more popular. I'm going to give you a little bit of a brief breakdown on them, kind of how they work, what's the goal with them, and then we're going to take a look at some data. Made another little graph looking at some of the information provided by HS Replay. So I think that'll be really interesting, and it has certainly changed quite a lot since the last time we took a look at it. So the first comp I'm going to cover here is probably one that if you've been watching some of my PvP videos or even just playing on ladder recently, you're probably no stranger to this comp. This is Valeera Varden with the Localar Cookie Sinestra bench. And basically what this build is trying to do is we are trying to use our Belinda as a Valeera comboer, and the other big reason why we are using Belinda is this ability right here. Water Elemental is an insanely strong summon. Just being able to freeze a character that it hits is just so big. As we all know, denying actions in Mercenaries is a very powerful thing, and when you're comboing it with Valeera, instead of this acting at 5 speed, after Valeera goes off, it effectively goes at 3 speed that turn. So it really is kind of a nice and quick way to snipe down an opponent on the first turn to prevent the scariest character they have on board from acting, assuming they can't protect it with something like a taunt. So then the kind of last piece of the opener trio here is Varden, and Varden's running Band of Frost mainly because kind of the whole name of the game of this comp is freezing your opponent. So basically between our Ice Elemental, Cold Snap, and Ice Lance, we have a lot of different ways to freeze the opponent here. And Cold Snap most notably, not only just locking out the opponent for a turn, if you get it off correctly, but scaling up a bunch of frost damage proves to be absolutely nuts. It's just, this is one of those comps where if your opponent does not have a way to kind of deal with it, like a Ragnaros to kind of shut down the freezing, or just a quick way to deal with the elemental and then the Varden, this gets out of hand really quickly, and it really starts feeling like a little bit of a solitaire game, because you're playing the game and you're not allowing your opponent to with the freezes. So even though it can be kind of annoying to play against this sometimes, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a ton of fun to play, and it did bring me a lot of success in the early days of the newly emerging meta. It's definitely a lot more popular now, so I think we're going to see some more counters pop up to deal with it, but even with that, I think it is still a pretty solid comp. Then we have Localar here. Localar has just been absolutely crazy. I'd probably rate him as the best new merc, just because you can pretty much run him in anything, and even if you don't have a ton of synergy, like with Varden or other Frost units, he's just still independently powerful, and Valeera is not going anywhere. She is still a top tier character, even though we do now have some more viable counter strategies against what she tries to do. She's still a very viable character, and so because of that, Localar is even better than he would normally be. Cookie, just Generally, we know how Cookie goes at this point. The extra health is really, really nice, and he's just a very powerful and versatile merc. And then another new merc here, Sinestra. Sinestra has just proved to be a crazy bench unit, just the most resilient of almost any merc we've ever seen. Just totally can sustain, can 2v1, can in some cases 3v1. It's just, Sinestra is a crazy strong merc, really like playing with her. The only thing you have to watch out for is now that she has become more popular, you need to be very careful with your planning, because if you end up with a Sinestra v Sinestra endgame, you're going to have a long drawn out tie because they can't do anything to kill each other. So you do have to be careful with saving, especially in this comp, just your 1 red local R to deal with an opponent's Sinestra off of the bench. But yeah, so that is our first comp here. Then we're going to take a look at the Frost local R CDC build. So this is kind of the one that I think became most popular initially. And frankly, the big reason for that is because it only requires 1 new merc. So if you just wanted to grind up 1 new merc without having to deal with grinding up any of the other 4, this is a great way to do it. You grind up your local R, he already stands out as one of the super powerful mercs from the bunch, and he fits very naturally into a Frost build. Frost opener with Jaina and Varden here. I do think in a build like this one, you probably do want to switch up your Band of Frost here back to the Chilling Amulet, and that is just some general advice I would give, especially if you're seeing more fire comps or just more comps with Ragnaros running around. Chilling Amulet ends up going a lot longer of a way than the Band of Frost, especially when you do not have Belinda to kind of get you those additional freezes with her elemental. And then bench for this comp, CDC, Karen Diablo Cookie. Pretty much we know the story here. One of the really strong benches, Reincarnation on Karen. Pretty much only comp that runs the Thunderous Sash is the Nature Valeera with the Karen Big Stomp on the bench, which I think is still an okay comp, but haven't really seen many people trying it out. So basically, we know what's up with CDC. It's still good. However, I do think with the kind of the new benches, especially with Sinestra, like we've been seeing, I do think CDC is going to fall off. But for now, it's still something that people deem worth running. Then we have the Meta Tyrant from last meta, the one everybody knows and loves, GVT Nature. So Grom, Valeera, Thrall, Nature. This was by far the most popular deck last patch, and easily one of, if not the strongest deck in the game. Just having a really easy combo enabler with Grom to slow down your opponent, get your Valeera going fast and hitting hard, and then following up with your Doomhammer Thrall to just absolutely delete a lot of greens or even non-green units just with his huge amount of attack power and Wind Fury with the Doomhammer. It's still a really solid opener. Are there more counters to it now than there were before? 100%. Local R kind of makes this comp have to rethink its first turn sometimes, as if they do end up going for their standard slam into Sinister Strike, into for the Horde, they do get heavily punished by a local R, so they do have to kind of play with that in mind. And I've also seen a few other kind of fringe comps that haven't really gotten popular yet, but seem to do very well against GVT. And we have the Nature Boys on the bench, Khan, Malfurion, and Cookie. Nature right up there with CDC as the most popular bench in the game last patch. And even though we're seeing some new variety now, I don't think nature will be going anywhere, especially after Brukan's Chain Lightning was actually given a little bit of a buff with a recent bug fix that allows it to no longer hit a target if that target died from Chain Lightning damage. So I think even though more counters have been introduced and there are more viable comps that can do well against it, I think the death of GVT nature was a little exaggerated by some people, and it is still a really powerful comp that is here to stay in the meta. Moving on, we have Shadow Valeera CDC. So this one kind of, in my opinion, this popped up as kind of a counter to one of the comps we looked at earlier, the Localar Frost CDC build, because leading with Localar and 2 blues, the Jaina and the Varden, basically what this comp is trying to do is you could actually pretty easily deal with a Localar just by kind of focusing with your Vol'jin and your Natalie and Valeera. I do think you had to have Eye of Shadow if you did want to kill a Localar. Basically, there's a break point right now where if you have a Localar that is not maxed, but it does have a cookie HP buff, it is possible for Shadow Valeera to kill that Localar on turn 1 before it can act by having Eye of Shadow on Natalie. And one important thing to know is if you have the cookie HP and the additional plus 5 HP from maxing out, they actually can't kill Localar on turn 1. So I do think the rise of Shadow Valeera is kind of because of 2 reasons. Mainly because of the popularity of Localar builds in a lot of different teams right now. Just having 2 blues to open seems pretty decent. And the other main reason is because we are seeing more fire leads because Frost is popular, and especially with that Frost freezing Valeera build, it is just easy to kind of stop what they're trying to do with Rag. And so this can kind of take advantage of more of the Rag openers running around, as Rag does not have a great time against Shadow. And again, running the CDC bench here, mainly I think just to give it a little bit more balance. Can't really run nature here, otherwise you'd probably be a bit too blue heavy. But again, nothing wrong with CDC, still a very viable and strong bench, but I do think as the meta progresses and people get their characters a bit higher up, we're going to end up seeing less of it. Then we have another popular comp from last meta, worth noting. It takes some time to get these new mercenaries up, so unsurprising that we are still going to see some comps pretty much unchanged from last meta, as they're still good. So Tyrion Frost here with the Karen Diablo Illidan bench. This is actually one of the few benches that kind of forgoes the use of cookie and really kind of goes all in on using this Ashbringer buff from your Tyrion to make your Karen Diablo Illidan bench super buff, super scary, able to deal with a lot of threats. This is actually a build I think could be pretty successful in the current meta. I haven't tried it since the new patch, but I did play a lot of it before the patch, and I think there's something here. I've ran into it a few times on ladder, and one thing that seems very strong about this comp to me is that with Sinestra becoming a much more popular part of the backbench meta, having that additional stat buffs on Karen, Diablo, and Illidan here actually enables us to possibly deal with the Sinestra, whether that be some super effective hits with Karen, or using Diablo's Apocalypse to allow Illidan to smack her for some super effective damage. The Warglaves of Azeroth is absolutely huge. It's just, I think this is by far the best item on Illidan right now, and I can remember at least 2 separate games where I had a Sinestra that normally probably would have soloed an unbuffed bench, but the additional stats they had from the Tyrion buff just made it too hard to kind of heal through the damage and kill them before they could kill me. So yeah, this, even though, again, much like GVT Nature, this was popular last meta, and I still think it is a very viable and very powerful comp available in the metagame. And much like on the other build, you probably will want your Chilling Amulet on Varden, as it is just kind of the more generically good item that even if your opponent does end up running a Ragnaros or something like that, at least you're still getting value off of the damage from the Death Rattle. And then our last 2 comps I'm going to go over here before we get into the data is they're both Belinda Valeera comps. However, they do have different backbenches. So let's take a look at these. So Belinda, Varden, Valeera, pretty much trying to make use of the synergy I talked about before, using Belinda's Elemental, using Varden with the Band of Frost, and Valeera to kind of speed up the Elemental. We'll start scaling up the Varden and enable a setup for a turn 2 Cold Snap. You'll notice here, though, the bench is quite a bit different. So this bench is actually rocking Ragnaros, Localar, and Jaina. So this isn't a build I have gotten to test out a whole ton myself yet, but I really do like the flexibility of it. Basically, with this kind of build, not only do you have a 2-2-2 setup of 2 greens, 2 blues, and 2 reds, so it's harder for your opponent to be able to predict what you're going to open with. It is also one of the most versatile comps in the game because there are a ton of different openers you could end up going with. You could end up going with Jaina, Varden, Valeera as an opener. You could go Fire with Belinda, Ragnaros, Localar. You could keep the Belinda, Varden, Valeera. There are just a lot of different openers that you can go for with this comp. And as I've talked about a little bit before on the most recent Fighting Pit podcast, when we were discussing the meta, I think this meta is going to be very favorable to comps that have flexible openers. And what I mean by that is normally, at least, in the past in Mercenaries, when people had a starting lineup and a backbench, they pretty much always started that same lineup and that same backbench. And with this release, I think now it is more important than ever to be able to kind of adapt and switch up what you're doing to be able to adequately kind of counter what your opponent is trying to do. And as we've seen with the prevalence of Frost comps, Ragnaros has just totally taken off, much more popular. I know he was kind of seeing play, a few metas ago, but then he kind of fell out of favor, and now he's back, and honestly feels better than ever. So this is a really cool comp. I'm going to have to play with it a little bit more before I can give more in-depth advice on the openers and whatnot, but I did still really want to mention it, as I think once it is figured out, which openers are best against which opposing comps with this, I think it does have potential to be one of the best comps in the game, purely because of the versatility it provides. And that last Belinda comp I had was actually a duplicate of the first comp we went over. So those are kind of the 6 ones I wanted to highlight so far from what I've seen in the meta and how things seem to be developing. But now we are going to get into it with taking a look at some data. So I'm going to pull up the data here, and this is a graph that I created making use of the data from HS Replay. This data is from the top 10% of Mercenaries players and was taken between January 25th, the release date of the patch, and February 6th, so just day before this video went live. So we had just under 2 weeks of time in the meta. It is worth noting, though, that first week we definitely did not see a whole ton of new mercenaries outside of local arc because people were still very busy grinding up. So it would not surprise me if things change again in another week or two as people have more of their mercenaries leveled up and start to figure things out. But as it is right now, let's take a look at the data. And so in terms of most popular comp, Localar Frost with the Karen Diablo cookie bench was clocked in at 3,000 games, whopping 22.3% of the meta here. And that was our most popular comp. Basically, I'm pretty sure, even though it is very powerful, I think the main reason this one was so popular is because it is the easiest of the new comps to grind up for, as you only need one new mercenary, and that one new mercenary has a very large impact. So, not too surprised about that one. Coming in second, we have another new comp, Belinda, Varden, Valeera, with the Localar Sinistra cookie bench. This one had 2,400 games with a 17.8% representation, so about 5% less than the Localar Frost builds, but still a very, very significant portion of the metagame. And next, we have GVT Nature coming in at 2,300 games with a 17.1% representation. Even though we do have a lot of Localar running around and it does feel more counterable than before, GVT is still a very powerful and resilient comp, especially with that nature bench. So I think it is going to be quite a while before we see it disappear entirely. And I think the kind of tales of it being dead due to some of the new counters were greatly exaggerated. So those are the three biggest of the new comps. They're actually the only three comps we had over 1,000 game sample size and over 10% representation. So it actually gets a fair bit more diverse here afterwards. The next one up is Shadow Valeera Karen Diablo cookie with Splinter of Nordrasil as the item on Natalie. This one came in at 950 games and it's just over 7%. Like I mentioned when we were going over this comp, I think this kind of reemerged as a possible answer to some of the Localar people were seeing, but due to the breakpoints, once Localar is maxed and has a cookie buff, this strategy I think is going to fall off a bit. However, I do not think it's going to fall off entirely, as it still provides a pretty strong game against fire comps, which are naturally going to be running around as long as we have the Belinda, Varden, Valeera builds in high popularity. Then we have Frost Tyrion, Karen Diablo Illidan with Warglaves on Illidan, clocking in at 870 games, 6.5% of the metagame share. And much like GVT, I think people just don't mind playing their old comps, especially while they're still working on leveling up the new characters. And since this time frame is from day of the patch to basically today, or I guess 1 day ago, it's unsurprising that these comps still represent a large part of the meta, even though it's not quite as large of a representation as it was pre-patch. Then we do start to see some other builds here. The numbers actually go down quite a bit. So that one was 6.5%. The next one up is the Grom Valeera Natalie build with the CDC bench. So we saw this one also in the last meta kind of trying to counter the GVT builds sometimes by stacking their 2 abilities, and other than that, we really haven't seen it take off very much. It hasn't been super popular on ladder in my experience, but it is still coming in at 570 games with a 4.2% metagame share. Next up is one of my favorite comps from last meta. This was Nature Valeera CDC with the big stomp item on Karen. This one was clocking in at 440 games, 3.3% of the metagame, and I think this comp has a lot to gain by the fact that GVT is not quite as popular as it once was. Obviously, GVT still represents a very large portion of the high-end metagame, but it is, I think, effectively cut in half, at least, as what it was before, if I remember correctly. So, a pretty significant decline in those numbers, I think naturally makes the Nature Valeera build better, as CDC was one of, or not CDC, GVT was one of its worst matchups. Then we have our Belinda builds. So Belinda, Varden, Valeera, Jaina, Localar, Rag, also coming in at 440 games and 3.3% metagame share. Basically, like I said before, I think this comp really has a ton of potential due to the flexibility, but it is by far one of the, I think, harder comps to play because there's so much versatility and flexibility in your opener. The correct lines are not always as clear or apparent as they might be in something that's a little bit more straightforward, like GVT Nature or Localar Frost. So I do think builds like this are going to still be popular as long as freeze is a big part of the metagame, because Rag just seems to be really, really doing well against that kind of stuff. Then we have our other Belinda build. So Belinda, Varden, Valeera, Cookie, Localar, Sinestra. This is the build that we were talking about before that really just tries to go all in on freezing your opponents. And we do actually have basically a 3-way tie here, as this one's also at 440 games, 3.3% metagame share. And that actually really surprised me because, at least in my experience playing the game, that is actually the comp I think I have run into the most. But obviously, everyone's experience is going to be a little bit different, especially, depending on the times you play and the rank you play at. So even though I've been seeing a whole ton of it, at least over these first 2 weeks, since it is a newer comp, it is still a much smaller relative portion of the recorded metagame. Then we have Grom, Valeera, Samuro Nature. This one I was actually very surprised to see. We did see a little bit of this last meta as well, but I don't really know what its kind of goal of countering is here, as I think it would fold over pretty hard to GVT Nature. So I'm not really too sure about this comp. It's one I haven't really seen in a while, and I was actually pretty surprised that it did clock in at 400 games and 3% of the meta. Then we have a different take on the Frost Tyrian build. It is the same in terms of units with your Tyrian, Jaina Varden, Karen, Diablo Illidan. The only difference is they are running Razor Fist instead of Warglaives on the Illidan. I'm of the opinion that Warglaives is generally the better item, especially in this new meta. However, I did used to really value the extra attack off of Razor Fist, so I can see why people are going for it. But it is a smaller portion of the meta, clocking in at 360 games and 2.7% metagame share. And we have a different take on GVT. So it's GVT, Grom Valeera Thrall, with a CDC, Karen Diablo Cookie bench. This one making up a much, much smaller portion of the meta compared to its kind of bigger, badder brother, GVT Nature, coming in at only 340 games and 2.5% metagame share. I do think that in the majority of cases, Karen Diablo Cookie is almost a strictly worse bench than Nature for this kind of build, so it really does not surprise me that it is taking up such a smaller portion of the metagame representation. And we're getting to our last few here. We have Belinda, Varden, Jaina, Cookie, Localar, Sinestra. So this build is kind of similar to the Localar Frost build, except instead of I guess it's a little bit different, right? Like we're using Belinda instead of Localar to lead, but the nice thing about this kind of bench is it is also very flexible, like some of the other Belinda builds we talked about before. One of the benefits of this build, even though it is a smaller representation, I think not running Valeera in some comps can definitely be a benefit with the popularity of Localar right now. He's just such a dominant unit against kind of her strategy of speeding everything up that it's not always a bad thing to just kind of go with something that tries not to go quite as fast. And much like some of the other Belinda comps I mentioned before, it has a very flexible opening, so you can lead with it in multiple ways, try different things to counter what your opponent is doing. Only 330 games, 2.4% representation. Then we have our second to last comp here. This is actually the first comp with Geddon in it. Was really happy to see this making the numbers. So Belinda, Baron Geddon, Ragnaros, Cookie, Localar, Sinestra. This one came in at also 330 games and 2.4% metagame share. So this one was really sweet. I've actually messed around with this quite a bit. I do believe this one is running your standard Localar equipment, so his second equipment with the frost scaling, but I did try out the extra elemental health and felt that could be a pretty fun and interesting option as well, depending on what you're going up against. I do think as long as Rag has a place in this meta, Geddon will kind of go up in value and be more viable, and especially now that we have Belinda to kind of complete our fire trio, I think there is some real game to fire that just really wasn't quite there before. And so we come to our last comp here, and it's not directly listed because we ran out of space, but you can see down below it's listed Shadow Valeera CDC with Eye of Shadow. This also came in at 330 games and 2.4% metagame share. And basically, we talked about it before, but the main reason to run Eye of Shadow in Shadow Valeera is because if they only had a cookie buff on their Localar, don't have it maxed, you can actually kill it on turn 1 with this build. And I think people were just trying to take advantage of that before people had put in the time and effort to max Localar for PvP while things were still new and people were still testing. So I do think this build is going to fall off over time. As we can see, it is only like a third the amount of popularity compared to the Splinter of Nordrasil build. So really not too surprised by that, and I think we're going to see its representation continue to go down a bit as more people start maxing their Localars. So I think the important thing to kind of look at here is we do have 15 comps total represented, And out of this 15, we have 9 comps involving Valeera. So it is a lot still. There is no doubt that Valeera is still a very powerful meta contender who certain comps are 100% going to be strategized around, but we are seeing a little bit less of her than we were prior. So we'll have to kind of keep an eye on it, see how things continue to develop. I don't think very many people have most of the mercenaries, the new mercenaries at least, maxed out. I know I've put a ton of time into it to get my stuff ready for the PvP videos, and even someone like me who's had a lot of time to put into it, have only been able to max out 3 of the new mercs. 2 of them are still very, very low level and require a lot of grinding. So I think naturally it's going to take maybe another week or so to kind of let people keep grinding up their new mercs and start experimenting with them more on the PvP ladder. But I thought this was a good way to just kind of get a feel for how things are initially shaking out. I do think I'm going to try and follow this up in 2 weeks from now, once we've had a little bit more time to see how the metagame has developed, and we can kind of look back and see, do things look similar as they do now in terms of representation, with Local R Frost, the Belinda, Varden, Valeera, and GVT Nature making up the biggest portions of the metagame? Or will we see some of these other comps with the little bit smaller representation right now continue to kind of grow and fight for their place in the metagame? And hey, there's probably a decent amount of comps out there that just have not been played enough to really show up on our radar or show up in the HS replay data. So of course, as more games get played and more stuff starts to be figured out, all of this will change. But that is what we have for today. I do want to thank you for watching. I do hope this has been useful to you, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the new meta. Are you liking the new characters and how it's developing? Are you not liking it? Pros, cons, all that kind of stuff. But I do want to thank you so much for sticking to it, watching the video. Really appreciate it. If you want, throw me a like, subscribe. Really does help the channel, and I do greatly appreciate it. But that's going to be it for this one. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.